Good morning, everybody. This is our Chapter 7 introduction. During this chapter, we have an enduring understanding statement. During its republic and early empire, Rome gradually conquered, controlled, and influenced the culture of the entire Mediterranean world. We're going to get into how vast the Roman influence and empire actually ran. We have some essential questions that we need to answer during this chapter. The first question is, how do different types of political organizations emerge, and how can new ideals lead to social and political change? I hope you guys enjoy this chapter. The Romans were a very interesting empire. They go through a lot of change, and we're going to see how that change carries over into our world and our political system today. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to get with me. Okay, so here's our bell ringer. This is a fresco painting of a Roman woman from Pompeii. We're going to ask a question about her in just a second. So the story matters. The myth of Rome's origin begins with twin brothers Romulus and Remus vying for control of the land along the Tiber River. It ends with Romulus becoming patriarch of a new civilization. Historically, however, Roman civilization developed over a long time. It began as a republic, but ultimately became an empire ruled by an emperor. This empire grew as a result of its military prowess and was maintained by the common language of Latin, strong leaders, and a vast system of roads. At its height, the Roman Empire expanded into Europe, Asia, and Africa, spreading not only its political control, but its culture. So let's go back to this painting, this fresco of this Roman woman from Pompeii. What can you infer about the woman's social class from the painting? So as we look at her, she looks well-to-do. She has great hairstyling, great clothing. She seems to be holding a book. And this is important because historically, through all the societies that we studied, women were not allowed to become educated. So what we're looking at here is that if you look at her clothing, her jewelry, and attention to grooming, we can likely say that she was a member of the upper class. So we're going to look at how the Romans actually allowed women from the upper class to become educated in their society. And this is a new change that we have not seen in any society that we studied yet. Okay, so let's step into the place right now. So on our right, we have a map of the Roman Empire. You see, obviously, that Rome is in Italy. That is something that you should know geographically. And like we said, the Roman Empire spread down into Asia, it spread over into Africa, and it spread into Europe. So they're controlling a vast majority of the known civilization at that time. From a small village in central Italy, Rome gradually expanded its control over the entire Mediterranean region and much of Western Europe. For centuries, Rome was ruled as a republic, but over time, elected leaders were replaced by emperors. So we need to understand the difference between a republic and an empire. What we have in our own country today is a republic, a group of elected leaders. And obviously, an empire is ruled by a single person or an emperor. The Latin language connected a vast empire and gave voice to Roman philosophy, oratory, and political debate. As the Roman Empire grew to encompass a large part of Western Europe and Western Asia, its superiority was maintained through technological advances in both civil engineering and military organization. So as we see on our map, starting at 12 o'clock position, about AD 122, Hadrian has a 73-mile-long wall built in northern England to keep out the barbarians to the north. Now quote the word barbarians, and we'll explore that word and why it's quoted a little bit later on. The temple in Nimes, France was built during the reign of Augustus and dedicated to his adopted sons. Augustus is an emperor that you should know his name right off the top of your head, and we'll obviously investigate him as well. The Roman Forum, center of civic life in Rome, was filled with government buildings, monuments, and temples to gods. And finally, ash from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 preserved the Roman city's architecture for future study. So we're going to talk about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and how it literally encased the whole entire city in ash. And that was a tragic event, obviously, because a lot of people lost their lives. But the ash actually served as an encasing agent that preserved the city for archaeologists down the road. So this is a quote from Pliny the Elder from Natural History circa AD 79. That's not your bell, stay seated. In great buildings, as well as in other things, the rest of the world has been outdone by us Romans. If indeed all the buildings in our city are considered in the aggregate or considered in whole, and supposing them, so to say, all thrown together in one vast mass, The united grandeur of them would lead one to imagine that we were describing another world accumulated in a single spot. So let's break that down a little bit. Basically, what he's saying is, if you took everything that the Romans have built, everything that every structure, and you put them all in one single spot in their entirety, someone from the outside world would look at them and say, this is a completely different world altogether. You're not describing something that is humanly possible, something that somebody actually did. And if you go back to the front of that quote, he says, the rest of the world has been outdone by us Romans. So obviously the Romans knew and they understood just how grand everything that they put together was. They took great pride in their architecture, and they wanted to present on a world stage just how grand the Romans were. And that's exactly what they did for their architecture. From the Colosseums all the way down to amphitheaters and different venues that they had. The Roman Empire was a very great and big city, not just in Rome, but everywhere that they had their influence. And that's something that we're going to look at in this chapter. So let's now step into the place. Here's another quote from Flavius Josephus from the History of the Jewish War. This was written circa AD 75 through 79. And he quotes, anyone who goes out of his way to examine the general organization of their army will realize that the Romans have acquired an empire of such an extent as a reward for their prowess, not as a gift of fate. In other words, he's saying, we've earned this. The extent of the Roman Empire is something that we've gone out and taken. We've earned it. This is not just something that fate or the gods have given to us by accident. He continues, whenever they invade a hostile territory, they always build a fortified camp before they engage the enemy in battle. Now, this is cool as we explore this. So basically, they're about to invade your city. You're a citizen there, and they stop at a hillside somewhere, and they just build their camp, waiting before they come down to engage you in battle. They actually set up shops with artisans and different places for their soldiers to eat and purchase things. They actually build like a miniature Roman city right there, telling you in a mental warfare sort of way, we're coming, but we can take our time because we know we're going to win. It is as if a city is created at a single stroke, complete with marketplace, artisan quarters, and council hall where the centurions and military tribunes can pass judgment on whatever disputes are brought before them. So wherever they went, they brought the Roman culture with them. They did not just take over a place, but they also put their influence and their way of life into this new city. Now, this is pretty grand. If you could imagine yourself being a citizen of one of these cities that you're about to take over, and you know the Romans are coming, you've heard the stories ahead of time, you're already beaten. You're already beaten before war engages, and it was a great exercise in mental warfare. So here's our first question, our data-based question, or DBQ. Given the size of their empire and the distances involved, how do you think the Romans maintained control over the subject peoples and spread their culture? How would they maintain this control? They had so much spread out. And typically when you spread out so far, it's hard to maintain control of your empire. Typically things would fall back to the way that they were before, but this was untrue with the Romans. How do you think they maintained this control? Well, what they did when they got to a place, they didn't just take it over and leave. They left people behind, different generals and soldiers and even citizens. They would move citizens in to just show their influence, to show their force. It became a Roman city. It wasn't something that was like, we're in control and you can maintain your way of life. They took over everything and they made sure to leave people behind that would influence and make sure that this control stayed in power. So they had a great plan. They had a lot of foresight and military planning, political and social planning in order to take over all these different territories that they did take over. This is actually pretty outstanding for the Romans to do this. This is something that today is hard to do. It's hard to reproduce this even in today's age. If you look at our own political climate today, we've helped the Middle East get rid of dictators, and we've tried to institute a political system of democracy, and it's hard to take because people have they are so set in the ways that they've had for so long that the only way to get it to stay the way that you've changed it is to leave forces in control. And so this is where we need to learn from history. As we pull out of places in the Middle East that we're trying to institute democracy and get a police force there that can run itself, as we pull out, it typically falls back to the way that it was because that force is no longer there. The Romans had enough foresight to understand that in order to change these things, your force and your presence must remain there. And that's exactly what they did. All right, so let's now step into the time. The first question we want to look at on our timeline is, when was Tiberius Gracchus assassinated for attempting agrarian reform? And we're going to get into this agrarian reform. Agrarian obviously means agriculture or land reform, where they were taking land away from the aristocrats and distributing it back to the peasants. So where on the timeline do we see that Tiberius Gracchus was assassinated for attempting this reform? If you look, you'll see that at 133 BC. Our second question is, in what year was the Roman Colosseum dedicated? If you find that on the map, on the timeline rather, you'll see the Roman Colosseum was dedicated in the year AD 80. This is 80 years after Christ's death. And our last question, how many years separate Julius Caesar taking military control of Rome and the ascent of Chandragupta II to the throne of India? This question is asked just so you can see what else was going on in the world at this same point in time. And if you find that on the map, it was, on the timeline, if you find that on the timeline, the years in between Julius Caesar taking military control of Rome and the ascent of Chandragupta II to the throne of India was approximately 429 years. So we see that the Romans were doing a lot of different things before other cultures were doing them. And this is just, again, another nod to how great and how grand the Roman Empire was. And that's the overall theme for this whole entire chapter, is the grand scale of how the Romans did things. When you look at their architecture, and we're going to watch a great video on the architecture of Rome, just how the grand undertaking and the scale and scope of some of these places that they built, it's amazing. It's utterly amazing. The Colosseum itself, and like I said, different amphitheaters and different venues where they had events. And there's a great thing on the Colosseum that I'm going to kind of keep that secret until you get to see it. But I think you should be shocked and amazed at what they could do in these shows that they put on. It's really a great thing to learn. So let's now review the introduction on the Romans. The first thing is, the myth of Rome's origin begins with twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, vying for control of the land along the Tiber River. It ends with Romulus becoming patriarch of a new civilization. There's a cool story behind Romulus and Remus. They were actually raised by wolves. This goes back to Roman mythology, which is obviously similar but different to Greek mythology. Our second review point is, for centuries, Rome was ruled as a republic, as a democracy, so to speak. But over time, these elected leaders were replaced or overthrown by these emperors, Caesar, Nero, different types of emperors, and they all follow the same cycle. They didn't learn from history. The empiratic cycle is one that always follows the same path, as I've been telling you from the beginning. And our final point of review is, as the Roman Empire grew to encompass a large part of Western Europe and Western Asia, its superiority was maintained through technological advances in both civil engineering and military organization. When we say civil engineering, we're talking about structures that were put in place for the benefit of the civilians, civil engineering. And we're also going to talk about military organization, how they organized their army and the way that they fought. We're going to look at some things and watch a couple of videos that are very interesting as in the civil engineering and in the way of aqueducts. They had running water. They had a sewage system. And the military organization, some of the things that they did, that they invented on the fly, some of the things that they brought with them, that they invented ahead of time, that made it so much easier for them to conquer other lands that just could not match their military superiority. So that's our introduction on chapter 7, the Romans. Like always, study for your vocab quiz for the next class meeting. Do your vocab activity and do your GRAs. We're going to move quickly and we're going to absorb a lot of information, and I hope you guys have fun. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please come see me. As always, be safe. I can't wait to see you guys next time.